Hey, this is Stu with the Military Investor Network, and I am going to go over a brief that I gave to a group of investors at one of our local meetups. And we're going to talk about arbitrage, and it's kind of a word that kind of gets thrown around a lot, and it's kind of used a lot in the investment space, kind of in the stocks and the Wall Street space. But we're going to kind of talk about how arbitrage can be used in a couple different areas to basically use leverage to maximize your return on investment. So by the books, by the dictionary Investopedia, what is arbitrage? It's basically the simultaneous purchase and sale of an asset to profit from a difference in the price. So it's a trade in the profits by exploiting the price differences of identical or similar financial instruments on different markets or in different forms. So an example that I use for this in the stock market is if you're buying and selling a stock, but in different stock exchanges. So if you bought a stock on the the British Stock Exchange, and then at a certain price, and then if you sold it at a price that might be different on the U.S. Stock Exchange, to where you could use that arbitrage and make some money on it. But we're going to look at it in a different light, not really on the stock exchange, but more in real estate. Then we're also going to talk about the lending business, and then some time and energy and skills and how we can basically exploit different instruments to return your investment on whatever that may be. So real estate, your biggest one is using your leverage ratio and your arbitrage spread, basically using other people's money. We can talk about house hacking and using rentable space or zoning. We'll talk about briefly how the banks make money using arbitrage, and then time and energy, and lastly some skills using arbitrage. So the biggest one here is the real estate. Using arbitrage, basically using other people's money to buy real estate instead of your own. If you're using banks at a lower interest rate than what your cap rate is, that's using leverage and arbitrage. You can use private money lenders or family and friends or crowdfunding platforms or hard money lenders. Or lastly, you can do some syndications to get partners in place and buy up real estate with a syndication. So a couple rules for arbitrage. Rule 1, you want to try to get a 2% arbitrage spread. And what that arbitrage spread is, the calculation is your cap rate on your property minus your interest rate. And you want to have that greater than 2%. So just question for you: how much would you borrow at 4% if you could invest and earn 6%? And the answer should be as much as you possibly could, because you're going to be using that arbitrage, that leverage, to make money. Rule number 2: you want to have a high leverage ratio, and you want to have your with positive cash flow. And we'll get into the leverage ratios in a minute, but it's basically how much money you're borrowing from the bank or from your private lender, i.e. if you're going to buy with cash, or if you're going to do 20% down or even less down payment. The higher the leverage ratio, the better. So the question for you is, using the same amount of money, would you rather have one house with $200 of cash flow or 3 houses with $100 of cash flow? And the answer is going to be more houses with less cash flow. You're going to have more diverse income and less risk. And that's where that high leverage ratio with positive cash flow comes in. So here's the example here. Let's say you have $100,000 in cash. You can do one of two things. You can either buy one house with all cash and you have basically zero in reserves, or you can buy multiple houses with 10% down or 20% down, and you're going to finance the rest. And then you have lots of reserves to sit and wait for something to happen. So in this scenario, who has more risk? The obvious answer is the one buying with all cash and zero reserves. And which one has the better return on investment? If you're buying the house with all cash on the left in the red, the example is if you're getting $800 a month in rent, and multiplying that by 12 months out of the year, $9,600 a year, and divide that by your cash that you put into it, your return is 9.6%. But on the right hand side, if you're buying the blue house using leverage and getting putting a down payment on and getting financing from the bank, your cash flow is going to go down. So this example shows $300 a month, and multiplying by 12, you're at $3,600 a year. But if you only did 10% down, so $10,000, your $3,600 divided by 10,000 in a year, your return on investment cash on cash is 36%. So obviously the return on investment is way better when you're using leverage. So here's the leverage ratio. You look on the far left column over there, that your leverage ratio, so 1-to-1 leverage ratio is going to be an all cash purchase. It's a $100,000 purchase price. 0 is financed, and so you're all in with $100,000. That's a 1-to-1 cash ratio. 2-to-1 is basically 50% down. You're putting $50,000 down on the $100,000 purchase price. So your 2-to-1 leverage ratio there is 50%. Your 5-to-1 leverage ratio, that's a 20% down payment, and a 20-to-1 leverage ratio is 5% down payment. So a question for everyone here on the Military Investor Network is, what type of loan product allows for military to maximize the leverage ratio? Basically 100 to 0, basically 0% down. And that's going to be that VA loan purchase for, you're going to live in the house for a little while and then either hold it and rent it, or you can do something like a house hack, which we'll talk about in a second, for arbitrage on your rental space. Okay, so if you put those two rules together, using your arbitrage spread and maximizing your leverage ratio, you're going to see how that works as far as you increase your leverage ratio but keep everything else the same, your return on investment is drastically going to go up. So the example here of leverage ratio is if it's 1-to-1, you're using an all-cash purchase. You have your arbitrage spread of 2%, which is your rule. And let's say this property that we're going to buy is 6%. So all-cash purchase is, you're going to get 6% return on your investment because you're using all of your own money. And as you go down and you look at your calculation, your return on investment is going to go up as your leverage ratio goes up. So if you're doing 50% down payment, your 2-to-1 ratio, Parts Bank, 2 minus 1 is 1. So 1 times your arbitrage spread plus your cap rate is 8%. And then going down your 5-to-1 leverage ratio, that's 20% down. So 5 minus 1 is 4. You're using 4 Parts Bank times your arbitrage spread and your cap plus your cap rate, you're at 14%. And if you did a 20-to-1 leverage ratio, your Parts Bank is 19. So 20 minus 1 is 19. Times your arbitrage spread plus your cap rate is your 44% return on investment. So obviously the more of other people's money you use, i.e. arbitrage, the better your return is going to be. So here's an example of using arbitrage for your rental space. And kind of the key term that people are using these days is house hacking. This is a great example of house hacking. So if you're using your leverage ratio of a 0% down payment, your 100 to 0 leverage ratio, and then putting tenants in all of your other rooms, this is a great way to use arbitrage for your rental space. So the example is here, that you have the red house, a 4-bedroom home, and if you put one tenant in it, paying $1,200 a month of rent, that's great. But if you split it up and you rent it out to each individual room, you have a chance of making more money on your investment. If you're renting each room at $400 a month, you could get $1,600 a month in rent. So this is, kind of leads into trying maybe to use Airbnb if you're in an expensive market, or finding houses in, areas where you can rent it by the room, maybe college towns, or military towns or something like that. Here's some other examples of using your rentable space. If you have a garage, or if you have a detached storage area, you could rent that out to somebody. If you have an attached apartment, or maybe an apartment above your normal living spaces, you could rent that out. And there's that house hack: you're living in one room and renting out the others. Parking spaces: if you have a bunch of parking spaces around your house or property, you could rent those out. I know people who have big yards, maybe that are around a college football town, and it's close to the stadium. You could rent out your parking space, basically rent out your grass to put cars in and park for football games. Airbnb is great, but there are so many other ways that you can use arbitrage for your rental space to make more income. Here's an example of zoning. If you look at different zoning laws, you might have a property where all you have on there is a single family house, but the property itself is zoned for multifamily. So you could go in, buy the single family house, and then build additional homes or build storage units or something like that, to where you can get more income for that property that no one else had ever thought of. Another one that we saw in one of the locations that we invest in is using a small piece of land that's zoned commercial, but there really wasn't enough space to put a big building on. This investor bought up the land and then put a food truck park on it, and it just exploded. It was awesome. So that's another example of using arbitrage for zoning. So let's talk quickly about how banks make money. Go to YouTube and search for the video "Truth Concepts: How Banks Make Money." It's pretty amazing, and you'll probably have your jaw drop at what banks do to make money. But basically, the big thing is they use arbitrage. They have someone put their money in the bank, put money in a savings account or a CD or even your checking account, and they'll promise to pay you a very low interest rate on your money, and then they basically use that same exact money that you deposited, and they'll lend out at a higher rate, or they have a credit card that is at a higher rate. And so if you put that into a calculator, you just Google and find a CAGR calculator, return rate. The example here is, somebody puts in money at 3%, put it into a savings account, they're making 3% on their money, which is probably really not realistic right now, probably more like 0.05%. But we'll use 3%, and then the bank lends that same exact money out at 15%. And if you do that for 1 year, the compound annual growth rate on that money is 400%. So it's pretty crazy. So you can do the same thing. Where could you find money to use and kind of play the same game of arbitrage that the banks do? Could you get a line of credit on your house? Maybe you have a personal line of credit or a business line of credit, or maybe you can just borrow some money from family and friends. And then think about what price you get that money at, and then what price you could lend that money out to other people. And if you have friends that are doing flips, you could lend that money to investors that are flipping homes. So here's an example of what we could do with our money. Let's say you have a line of credit at the bank, and you could borrow, let's say $100,000 at 6% from the bank on a personal line of credit, and then you could use that same exact money to lend it to a friend of yours that's flipping a house, and lend it at 12%. So if you do the calculation on that, Your present value is 6, your future value is 12 over 1 year. The compound annual growth rate of that money is 100%. And remember, none of that was yours to begin with. So that's exactly what banks do. And so you could do the exact same thing using arbitrage. Here's another example of arbitrage, but this is for your own time. A lot of people say that you can't create more time, but using arbitrage, maybe you can. You really want to exploit the fact that activities are more optimal at certain times than others. Look up Pareto's Principle and using the 80-20 rule, and understand when you work best. I know for me, I work best in the morning. I'm a morning person, so I will wake up early and knock out as much as I possibly can early in the morning before I have to go to my full-time job, before the kids wake up, before life kind of gets going. So if you understand when you work best and understand what is optimal as far as your 20% of your time used, you could probably create more time with arbitrage. And so you want to look at what can you do today to put processes and systems in place that will multiply your time down the road, and look at what's important, what's not important, what's urgent, and use this little graph here that Rory Vaden created to put systems in place and make sure you know what's significant and how long it will matter. He wrote a great book, and there's actually a TED Talk on it called Procrastinate on Purpose. I won't get into the details of it, but basically, he's taking things that come up throughout the day, and if you can take a task and go through this process of either eliminating the task or automating it by putting processes and systems in place, or delegating the task. And then you look at really what is truly important to get done now, and you concentrate on that. And then anything else you're going to procrastinate and do it later, and put it back through that same focus funnel to potentially eliminate, automate, and delegate down the road. And really this can free up a lot of your time by doing this focus funnel. And I would say that is a time arbitrage. Skills arbitrage, you should know what you're good at and what you're not good at. So exploiting someone else's ability to perform the same services that you aren't skilled in. So for me, an example is building our website. I am not good at graphic design and website stuff, but thankfully my wife is. So I basically have used her skills to help do all that stuff. And it's the same with your team. In the real estate space, you want a great team on your side, and you're going to use those skills from other people to help you in your business. You want to have a CPA, you want to have an attorney, you want to have a real estate agent, a servicing company, business partners, mentors. All those people you can use for your skills arbitrage to help you do better in your business. Okay, so that's it. That was the presentation that I gave at one of our meetups. Hope you enjoyed it. Some resources: look into these YouTube videos. Search Truth Concepts: How Banks Make Money. You'll probably be incredibly surprised at how much money they actually make on your money. And look at some of these concepts from one of my mentors. His name is David Campbell. YouTube video, Intro to Hassle-Free Cash Flow Investing, and then that TED Talk of How to Multiply Your Time by Rory Vaden. And there's that book, Procrastinate on Purpose. It's really good. Highly recommend it. So hope you guys enjoyed it. Please share this with others. Please like it on YouTube and post on your own Facebook. We'd greatly appreciate it. And please spread the word about the Military Investor Network. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Have a great day.